All right. So, on Friday, which feels just like yesterday, we had just left off talking about, generally speaking, reptiles, right? Remember that we had first talked about synapomorphies, which we kind of talked more generally about amniote synapomorphies, right? This is a larger group. And being an amniote really means having that freedom from water. So we talked about what were the synapomorphies that allow our amniotes or organisms to be more successful or more married to being on land, so to speak. All right, so we looked at things like the amniotic egg, better jaw muscles that allow for better bite force, right, what have you. Then we just started to look at some unique characteristics within the reptiles. Okay, aside from internal fertilization, right? We crossed that off. It was an amniotic synapomorphy, so it was a mistake. But we looked at the rest of these and said, well, what about these allow us to identify these as reptiles themselves? Okay, and then we started looking at order, right, this sub-umbrella within reptiles alone, right? The Testudinae, in other words, are tortoises and turtles. So we looked at the different superfamilies of turtles, right? In other words, the different groups of turtles that exist and how we sort of recognize them or how they're classified basically by habitat. And by types, we say, well, they're basically the mean turtles, the water turtles, the edible turtles, right? And we left off at the very end of class talking about what are these very general turtle characteristics that we recognized, right? And so the very first thing we talked about was, well, the shell, right, is the thing that really makes a turtle a turtle. And so what is it about this shell that makes it it? Said, well, of course, the first thing is that it's made out of a different type of scale, right? We know that reptiles are covered in scales, but the shell is made altogether of something much harder. That's what makes turtles special. We call these scutes, right? And they're very much related to those hardcore fish scales we looked at many moons ago, right? Those ganoid scales. The ones that we saw on things like gars and sturgeons. Okay. Then we also said, well, they have to have an axial skeleton, okay, the bones that run up the middle of your body, right, a spine and ribs and all of that stuff. But they weren't super obvious if we think about having done our dissections last week. So at the very end of class, we reminded ourselves that our axial skeleton, the ribs and the spine exist, right, but they're fused to that shell. And that's sort of what gave us the organs in a bowl kind of perception when we took that plastron off, right? Everything is really fused in particular to that carapace, right? The big rounded dorsal shell. Okay, that's where we left off on Friday. Okay, any questions about that? Who wants to get out of mouth? Before we move forward. So thinking about the turtle shell then, this is one of the conversations in your lab packets as well. This causes some restrictions on the way that turtles can breathe, right? Now, we still have some negative pressure type breathing, right? But if your ribs are fused to your shell, there's not a way for the intercostals, right? Remember those muscles that are between your ribs to expand or contract, right? Your ribs are stuck the way that they are. That also means that your whole thoracic cavity itself, right? We expect ours to get bigger and smaller. Again, probably not going to happen for Mr. and Mrs. Turtle because it's stuck and fused to exactly the size and shape that it is because, well, it's a shell. So as we think about what we know about turtles, this causes a lot of problems. So the way that they kind of get around dealing with the fact that their ribs can't move, can't help, and are not going to change size is we have two separate diaphragms, right? We have one located at the bottom of our rib cage. They still have that one. It's at the bottom of the rib cage. It's the bottom of about where you would still think it would be. Okay, more or less the top half of their body. They also have a second diaphragm. Okay, all do. Basically, their cloacal diaphragm. Okay, so this is dealing with our blue box then. So the second diaphragm is going to take the place of their intercostal muscles. Right, so we can move two things to make a bigger space, right? And just like we move two things, we move our rib muscles and diaphragm, right? They're just going to move both diaphragms and achieve the same goal. So if I move both diaphragms outward, diaphragms are just thin muscles, right? Then this space gets slightly larger. Okay, just like our negative pressure breathing does, right? Bigger space. Okay, lower pressure, they can take a breath in. Okay, if I move my diaphragms inward, okay, that compresses that space. This space gets smaller. Okay, my lungs get slightly smushed, right? So the air and the space in there gets compressed, right? My volume gets smaller, my air pressure gets higher, so the air comes out. So we still follow all of our rules from negative pressure breathing. We're just doing it with a butt membrane, right? Instead of our rib intercostals. Because we can't use our rib intercostals. So that's an icebreaker you can now use at a party. Turtles breathe with their butts. Okay, everybody see what's happening here? Okay, and this is common as we'll find with our reptiles is their body shapes are going to cause issues with the way that they respire, right? So that shell sort of problematic in the way that we normally breathe in and out. Okay, reproduction for turtles. We're already pretty familiar with this, and we know it has to be internal fertilization. Everything has to be internal fertilization, right? That's a synapomorphy. Okay, we know from lab, right, that they're using things like their tails as intromittent organs. All of our turtles are oviparous. Isn't it nice to finally have an organism that has just one mode? Well, less to remember. Okay. Now, we do know that turtles have a little bit of uniqueness when it comes to reproduction. All right, so all of this stuff, these first two markers, are always the same. Okay, the last bit is the bit that gives them a little bit of variety. So how they or where they lay their eggs is where their sex determination comes from. Okay, so all eggs are gender neutral upon fertilization. And so how warm the eggs are within the nest through an important developmental stage will then dictate whether those eggs will be male or female. Okay, and as we can see here, it's parabolic. Okay? In other words, there's like a sweet spot, a warm, that'll make ladies. And then everything else outside of that temperature zone, right? Too cool, you're going to get a boy, right? And too warm or too hot, you're also going to get boys. Okay, so as we look at the nest diagram we see the stuff all the way at the bottom, right, really far away from the top warm sand. Those will be boy eggs, right? And the stuff way up at the top that are exposed to the most heat, right, those are also boy eggs. Okay, but the stuff right in the middle, perfectly sandwiched, getting just the right amount of warmth, those are our girl eggs. You know, generally speaking, this is a good thing, right? You always lay your eggs in the same spot. You're very good at digging holes that are always the same temperature or depth, right? You can bury them or unbury them a certain amount. Okay, something that these populations are very well practiced at, as long as people aren't jerks and unburying their nests, right? So you can get a very good ratio of boys to girls. Okay, plus they lay like hundreds of eggs. Okay, so theoretically, right, you should get a good gradient of males to females. Now, what is the inevitable problem that we are seeing lately? Climate change is a big problem. Why is that a problem?
Because like the increase in temperature would it affects the sex of the turtles being hatched, so like some females aren't being hatched.
Excellent, right? So as we're seeing climate change, particularly in these areas that are already warm, this is generally bringing the whole temperature of the nest up, right? Meaning we're seeing a big shift. So we're just getting more and more warm. Overall, not getting very many females and getting lots and lots of boy turtles, right? So we're getting really skewed sex ratios of lots of males and not a lot of females, right? In general as well, when we see very quick shifts in anything in temperature, it's going to lower the overall egg survivorship, right? It's just a really hot nest, right, isn't just going to make boys. It's eventually there'll be a too hot for the eggs to survive period business, right? Boy eggs are tough, right, but they're not perfectly survivable. Okay, so sort of like our amphibians, this is one situation where turtles are a little more vulnerable than our other reptile friends to some of the changes that we see. Now, we also know people kind of suck, right? So they tend to go out on beaches and they're like, oh, look at the eggs. And then bad news for the turtles. So their eggs are dug up. It's easier for predators to get at them and all these other issues. Right. So this is some of the other issues that we see when it comes to turtles, right? So when we're talking about high juvenile mortality, okay, people play a really big role in this, right? We live on the same beaches they breed on. We're not quite as respectful as they are to our spaces. So we dig them up, our pets dig them up, okay? They hatch at night. So one of the other common issues that we see, and this comes into these two pieces as well, is generally speaking, many of these organisms go towards being photoreceptive. So they go towards the brightest spot on the horizon, which classically has been stars and moonlight glittering off the ocean, right? Nowadays, it's, you know, a giant city sitting on the other side of the beach. And so about half the baby turtles just walk the wrong way and then walk into traffic, which is not great. A lot of beach districts now house blackout weeks when they know that the turtles are going to hatch, which helps extensively with these kinds of issues. We already talked about climate change. Okay, collection is a big issue. We talked about turtles being food. More problematic, though, are things like the pet trade, right? So turtles being collected as pets and either being oversold, being transferred as invasive species, or I don't know if you guys have seen like these horrific like live turtles as keychains kinds of things. And we can imagine how long a turtle lives inside a keychain. So not super ideal. As well as turtles live a super long time. So baby turtle is fine, but it may take up to 80 years for them to have their first baby. Right? So they mature very slowly. When we talk about maturation, we're talking about sexual maturation, right? To become an adult and contribute back to the population. A lot can happen between getting hatched or being laid as a vulnerable egg, right, and actually growing up. Some of which we know are problematic, right? Baby make it off beach, hard, right? Baby gets turned into keychain, bad, okay? Some of these things we can control, and then there's some things we just don't know, right? For example, with loggerhead sea turtles, we can help them get to sea, and then we don't even see them for like 100 years till they come back to hatch, lay their own eggs, and then hatch again. Kind of hard to help bolster their populations when they're just like out to sea for 100 years. So a lot of moving parts when it comes to these animals. Okay, any questions about our turtles? I just like, I don't know what they do up there, man. Okay, our next subgroup, okay, largely referred to as the Lepidosaurs, okay, which is a larger sort of colloquial umbrella name. It has to do with their ability to drop their tails. Okay, but more formally, because we're going to ignore one of the smaller subgroups, which you may see on some of your student slides, the rhinocephala, we're just going to ignore. So we're going to jump straight to talking about the squamates, which is by far the larger of the two subgroups here in the Lepidosaurs. So our squamates are our lizards and our snakes. So you'll see I popped over basically the Australian and New Zealand lizards. Okay, so our squamates are a much bigger group, much more generalized, and probably very familiar. In part because if you've encountered some kind of animal, probably, particularly from around here, this is probably what you've encountered one way or the other. And this is also, again, one of the groups that we encountered in lab. So, right, we have two ways we can think about these generally, right? With lizards, of course, they're four-limbed, using the legs to the outside, like all of the other of our reptiles, okay? We do have loss and reduction of limbs, right? With our regular snakes, right, they have no limbs at all. There is another sister species on here, all right, the Amphibians, which basically look like snakes that have weird, sort of terrifying, teeny front limbs. Okay, and again, those tend to be fossorial animals. Okay, now, remember again, we can very much generalize. Everything has to be doing internal fertilization, okay, one way or another. Okay, now we know from lab that this is done via the hemipene. Okay, again, a very special intermittent organ. Okay, we did our best to see these. This is extraordinarily hard to see in a dead animal. Okay, so this is what hemipenes do look like when the organism is alive, right? So hemipenes are normally inverted inside the body unless they're being used. So these are everted, right, basically ballooned out, okay? So hemipene literally meaning having a dual penis, keeping in mind these both cannot be used at the same time. It just allows for increased frequency of use, right? Because most of the time, particularly snakes, for example, exist in mating balls. So you would frequently mate more quickly and in a shorter time span. Whereas with other animals, you may go days or weeks or sometimes years, right, without encountering another of the same species. So it's basically a split on the same organ. Okay, so we kind of know this already as we're thinking about our squamates. Very generally, we are using all three types of parturition, which means that's not going to help us, and that's fine. It's not an identifying feature. Okay. So not only are we using oviparity, viviparity, and ovoviviparity, but remember from way back in the beginning of the semester that several of these organisms can also use parthenogenesis. Okay, so remember, what's parthenogenesis? They're all the same sex. So how do I have babies? They're cloning. Okay, so squamates are going to be one of our groups, one of our orders, that we really see almost the most variety in reproductive tactics. Okay, we have to use internal fertilization, using that hemipene as an intermittent organ, but beyond that, okay, depending on what species you are, there's a bunch of flexibility on how you can do it. Okay, now that being said, you do see off to the right here that we are able to have a discussion on, well, what is the most common? So viviparity here is the most common, and there's some reasons for that. All right, so most of the time, okay, as weird as it is to imagine, because we all kind of imagine like this disturbing clutch of snake eggs, right? Most of the time we are having live birth, right? Little lizards running free, immediately being born, right? Some snakes even being born live, right? We've seen this, particularly in our non-venomous snakes, which there are more of, okay? And there's a lot of benefits. Remember from what we know, right? This gives the offspring a really good head start. They're not sitting in that vulnerable egg stage. There's no nest guarding that has to occur, okay? And females have a lot more control over protecting the offspring as well, okay? Now remember, this still has that same disadvantage. And one, right, remember mom is more vulnerable, okay? And two, it reduces how many pregnancies, right? A clutch is number of times you can have offspring a year, okay? So if I have to carry those offspring around with me, in me, quite literally as a female, okay, I can't get pregnant a second time while still being pregnant, right? Whereas if we had just laid a clutch or a pile of eggs somewhere, theoretically, if they all died, okay, or if I was very healthy, we could just pull it away 2 weeks later, lay a second batch of eggs somewhere else. Okay, so eggs have more flexibility in that way that live birth does not, right? You're much more committed to the one batch. You better hope it's good. we haven't done one of these forever. Whew. Let's go ahead and do a Menti. I feel like I've done a lot of talking lately. I know we've got a lot to get through, but it's nice to be able to take a little break. There we go. All right, so as we think about squamata and thinking about their movements, okay, are their movements and activity levels going to be long distance movements or short distance movements? Excuse me, gracious. I'm very short-handed today. All right. Okay, so the most popular answer is short distance or short burst movements. Why would this be? And this is correct. So why is our expectation that squamates in particular can't do long distance running or slithering as appropriate?
It's like energy conservation.
So energy conservation is a big piece of it. Would we have the same problem with, say, a turtle or a rat? Not necessarily. Why? What makes lizards and snakes different?
The limbs, like their body shape, how they like slither around, they can't go very fast.
So this is a key piece, right? So their body shape is core to why this is the problem. Oh my gracious. Yes, thank you. Rude little thing. Well, I guess that's just going to stay on there, but not actually transfer any that you guys did, so that's fine. So as we think about our body shape, okay, but specifically how the body shape is going to relate to our respiratory organs. So they have a similar but different problem with respiration that our turtles did. So remember that all of those rib muscles are key to how we breathe in negative pressure breathing. This was a problem our turtle had because, well, he or she couldn't move their rib muscles, right? Okay. This is also going to be a problem when we think about how our lizards or snakes are going to deal with this, right? Because as we just pointed out, their body shape is really important to how they move. Okay, so if we imagine a snake slithering, okay, they're going to use those rib muscles to slither side to side. Okay? Same thing with our teeny little lizard, whoosh, legs out to the side, snap, 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 right? All of these core muscles here, and both of our squamates. No, I'm gonna draw you. Yeah, I'm a lizard. Okay, all of those muscles are being used to move. Okay, if I'm using these muscles to move, you cannot also use them to breathe. Okay, it has to be either or. I'm contracting the muscle to move, means I also can't contract it to breathe. It's already contracted. So if I'm moving, I'm basically holding my breath. Which is fine, but you can only do that so long, right? So this is where we get the short bursts in. I can move while holding my breath, but eventually I'm going to have to breathe, right? So that means I'm going to have to stop moving so I can use my muscles to respire for a second before I start moving again. Okay. So we're not going to get any long, hardcore chases out of a snake. They're going to be short. Maybe able to run you, okay? But they're not going to be able to long distance run you. It's a great lizard, by the way. Give him little eyes. Now he's very convincing. And this is another major piece that we can help study our lab stuff with. Okay, don't forget as we think about our excretions, right, that all or most of our reptiles in general are using this uric acid. Remember, reptiles and birds are very closely related. So we'll see this come up again in aves. Okay, so it's a lot about water retention, lots of energy being used to create this very low toxic urinary output, where we've gone out of our way to retain as much water as possible, right? Bird pee and bird poop. Okay, so in the same way, reptile pee and reptile poop look very, very similar. Okay, so all of this key here is we're going to reabsorb, you rude, reabsorb as much water as possible, okay, using our kidneys and bladder. Okay, and then, of course, some of our reptiles have salt glands on their nose, right? We might think something like a marine iguana. So reptiles are really, really, really good, almost fish level good at retaining water. Not quite fish level good, right? The fishes knew what they were doing. But this is pretty good at getting that saltwater balance down. It just feels like they're hosing something down. Like teaching the wrong class, but just sounds cool. Okay, now there are some unique things for snakes alone, and we don't want to ignore that. Take a pause real quick. Does everyone feel okay about what we've done so far? Make sure I'm not burning through stuff. I know some of these unique things can go a little quicker. So I want to make sure we don't forget about them. Okay, so for our limbless squamates, right? So basically our snakes. They have a much more elongated body, and generally speaking, right, most of our reptiles in general have no external ear openings. Okay, now we still have a hole, right, the tympanum, they can hear, but we're not going to have any big features here. So the big key, of course, that's setting these guys apart is that forked tongue, right? So their vision sucks, their hearing sucks. Okay. And a lot of this is because we're super, super low to the ground. We don't even have legs to lift us up. Gracious. So the forked tongue is where it's at to really guide us around. Okay, so this idea, this isn't split here. I'm just drawing poorly. It's just split at the end. Okay, we really are using what's called the Jacobson's organ and the Vilmer nasal organ. So Vilmer nasal is just where it is, right up behind the soft palate. So they stick their tongue out, right? They're getting particles of air on the tips of their tongue, right, in two directions. And then they bring that in and basically lick the back of their throat up behind their nose. Okay. So they're getting a combination of smell, because of its location, and taste. And because it's forked, they're also getting direction, right? Is it coming from the left or right? Okay, so this can also tell them, do I need to go this way or that way to follow the prey that I'm going after, as they're literally smelling and tasting the air to do so. Okay, so this is why the tongue is forked. Okay, now, because we don't have legs, yes, ma'am?
What was the Jacobson organ?
So it's just two organs.
Okay, so
They both help with smelling and tasting for hunting.
Okay.
Ultimately, it's like one giant organ. The whole thing itself being named after Jacobson himself. And it's located in the Vilmer nasal region, aka way back up where they swab your brain and you get the COVID test. So if we're going to move, and ultimately there's a couple of different techniques for movement with snakes, but they're all based largely on one concept, right? We don't have legs, and so we need to get friction with the ground, okay? And so our scales are really the key to doing so. So remember, dorsal means back, ventral means belly. So my ventral scales are going to be key to my success here. So we see with my ventral scales that they're all unidirectional, right? This is my head, and this is my butt. Okay? So my ventral scales are all moving one way. And the key here is they're very rough and almost kind of hooked. Okay, and that sort of hooking nature, where they overlap each other, kind of like shingles on a roof, catches and grips the ground, right, as I'm moving this way. You can kind of think of like foop, foop, right? It's going to grab as I drop my belly, grab the ground and move, right? Oh, come on, man. Thank you. 8 tries later. So no matter what technique, right, and there's lots of different ways snakes can move, right, from sidewinding to slithering. It all depends on the ability of those ventral scales to be able to grab the bottom. And so as we see this video sort of play in the background, researchers do all sorts of funny things with snakes. And one of the keys is they like put little funny sweaters on snakes to block their belly scales from being able to touch the ground. And when you do so, they basically slip around. It's really sad, but also really hilarious. Watching these snakes flop around a little bit. And when you take that off, it shows the key, the connectiveness of these ventral scales with any, you see them really well here, right, the one-sided nature of those scales to be able to grab. And so here we see, right, if they're grabbing, once you've grabbed, right, we have this edge having grabbed, you rude thing, right, we can push. And this is what we mean by this image on the right, grab and push, or thrust, right? Thrust just means to push or be able to move forward.
So the snake only touches the ground in like very small areas and just pushes itself.
Very much so, yep. So despite the fact we kind of imagine the snake being super flat at all times, it's kind of like your feet, right? Your feet are not touching the ground on all points, and both of your feet, when you're walking, right, are not touching the ground at all points at the same time. And it's the same way with a snake's body, right? When it's moving, only certain parts of its body are going to be touching the ground at a given point in order to move it along. Okay, now we know feeding with these guys is also unusual. Get up. So remember, we do have teeth and some unusual skull shape, right? So we do have some modified teeth, okay, aka fangs in the front, okay, which is going to give us one of the only times we see a variety of teeth. I am not starting a quiz. I have no idea what I'm doing. There we go. Throw a space race up here. That's not what we need. But otherwise, by and large, those things being aside, okay, all of the teeth in the mouth are the same, and we're still not chewing. Okay, we're still not going to see any chewing. So aside from potentially, not all snakes and lizards or any of those things have venom, right? The teeth are in here, right, just to hold our prey still. This is still the theme we see, right? It's just immobilization, okay? So just like with our frogs and amphibians, right, the key is we want to get our mouth as big as we can, okay? Which with snakes in particular, we can basically literally unhinge our jaw, right? So like frogs, we can get obscenely large jaws. And in this case, jaws that get bigger than our head, right? Because we can actually snap open our jaw in one side at a time and get prey that's bigger than our face. And this is why snakes are such voracious predators, right? Is because they can eat things that are so large. Okay, in addition, right, immobilization, like with fishes, is so important. Okay, so there are ways that we can immobilize our prey because we don't chew and tear it. So we have two ways that we can do that. Constrictions, of course, being one. Okay, literally suffocate or break the bones in your prey. Again, this is rarely killing it. Sometimes it can. Most of the time, you just want it to stop struggling long enough to eat it. Okay, so if you're a very big snake, that's great. Okay, otherwise, as we know, venom injections are very common. And these come in two forms: neurotoxic, okay, aka I'm going to make your heart stop beating or your lungs stop moving because I've pulled the nervous innervations from them. Or hemolytic, okay, meaning I make all your blood cells explode, so you end up bleeding out. Let's just, I guess, pull this top one. I already have your Socrative up. So we will finish up reptiles and start on birds on Wednesday. Correct? Yes, it is correct. All right, y'all. Hang in there. Don't forget about your zoos, and I will see some of you this afternoon for our final dissection. We getting there. And when you are all done, you can go and have a good day. Say again for me, Claire? Next week. Okay, perfect. I think she did already. I saw it in my inbox. So they should be there for you. Otherwise, she'll mention it this week in class. Mm-hmm.